Take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Breathe. You've arrived at the Evolving Lover podcast. This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online. Now, here is your host, the funny, thoughtful, and loving Steve Burford. Enjoy.
Today we've got Anita Teresa on the line. She's an integrative sexuality coach based in New York, and she's the founder of the Sex and Medicine Summit. She's also appeared on Dr. Oz's show, News 12, New Jersey Progressive Radio Network, and she has her own podcast and done many different interviews. She's been studying recently the whole history of matriarchal societies. So we're going to be speaking today roughly around the kind of what's been going on now and also in the past when it comes to male-female relationships and the structure of society, how that relates to our sexuality and relationships. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Hi Anita, how are you doing?
Hey, good. Thank you for having me on. This is fun.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting chat. I gave you a brief introduction today. Could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do and what you've been up to these last years in your work with sexuality?
Yeah, sure. So people often ask me, how did you get into doing work around sexuality? And I worked at NYU Hospital for 5 years and other clinical settings throughout the years. And I was sort of an in-between person. I wasn't a doctor or a nurse, and I wasn't exactly, a clinician either, but I was there mostly running programs in alternative health, like hypnosis for pre-surgical patients. And I started to innovate and do classes in yoga and somatic movement and even Tai Chi for the patients and also the staff. And over the course of those years, I was also studying many things on the side, including Tantra and Taoism, and just having numerous experiences in all of these other realms that had nothing to do with the clinical paradigm. And I saw this huge gap in the paradigm of medicine and healing, like actual healing, like what brings people healing. And every time that I would guide these classes, especially for people who had chronic illnesses, and I would guide them into their body and just basically giving them an experience of pleasure through very simple movements and breath and connecting to their sensuality. And time again, over the years I was there, I had patients tell me afterward, for the entire hour, I didn't feel any pain. And I know when I come to your class that I'm going to forget that I even have a disease, that I'm going to forget my diagnosis. I won't be thinking about anything else but just feeling good. And the whole paradigm of medicine is around sort of pain and suffering, and in a way it's so focused on what's wrong, and it's nothing about pleasure, and yet pleasure is so healing. So that, long story short, it took me down the road of creating my own summit to bridge that gap in the two paradigms, one around pain and one around pleasure, and to give medical professionals more tools and more information and insight into the connection between sex and health, and sex being bigger than just an act between two people or with one person. It's really all of life and our relationship to our bodies and pleasure and to our expression and our creativity. So that's been my mission for the last few years, is guiding people into their innate ability to experience more pleasure and sensuality as a healing force.
Nice. I think that's a whole podcast in itself. We'll have to do maybe at a future time about that journey and what it's been like to teach doctors and nurses and the medical industry about these things. Must be very, very interesting. But today we're going to focus on something you've been looking at in recent months. I'm not sure how long you'll have to tell us, but around matriarchal societies and how that links to what is happening today with kind of the gender difference are very stark and obvious, especially in the media, when it comes to the political environment, specifically more in America, and then the Me Too campaigns. Yeah, it's quite obvious that we need to be having more of these conversations. Part of the reason why I started this magazine 5 years ago was to have more compassion between the sexes and for us to understand each other better, and as well as sort of improving our sex lives and everything along the way. So I think this is a very important discussion. But where would you like to sort of frame the conversation? What work research have you been getting up to?
Well, one thing I'm noticing is missing. I kind of always look for what's not being talked about. I don't know why I do that, but I'm curious. I'm always curious, what's missing from the conversation or missing from the picture. And there's a lot of feminist dialogue and rhetoric and narrative being put out there, and I appreciate a lot of it. I think it's valid and important, and I think it's a lot of this is a phase in terms of some of the more difficult or pointed things that are sometimes said in media, and there's a place for anger and all of that, and accountability, and there's certainly a need to point out what doesn't work, and all of that is true and valid. But what I find unfortunate is that it's when people speak about patriarchy, typically they reference like patriarchy as if it's been around forever, or they talk about women's oppression as if that's always been the case. And there's no mention of the probably up to 1 million years of history prior to sort of modern patriarchy where it wasn't that way. And of course, we don't have records going back that far, but we do have a significant amount of information now that there were many matriarchal societies. They still exist even today, and those, even the ones that have kind of given way to more patriarchal societies, there's still an undercurrent there. So if you dig deep enough, you don't have to dig even that far to find out about matriarchal culture and what it actually is. It's not just replacing our present culture with women being in charge. That isn't what matriarchy is. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people reference matriarchy in that way.
What do you define, or on your research, have you defined as a matriarchal society?
So most matriarchies have been egalitarian. So it doesn't mean that only women rule. I mean, in some cases, yeah, that was the case. But in many of the larger matriarchies, like, for example, the Akan people in West Africa is a good example. The men still have political and financial power. They're often the ones leading and so forth. But the women, there's always some kind of counterbalancing council of elders made up of women, like the grandmothers of the towns or the clans. And this was also the case for many First Nations peoples in the U.S. Many of the, like the Hopi, the Sioux, they had tribal councils in place, and there would be always this counterbalancing force of female-led elders and advisors. So even if a chief was making decisions, and they'd have to run it by the entire council, there'd have to be a unanimous decision on something, or as close as possible to unanimous choice. And there was no such thing as, a sort of dictator rule or the patriarch decides what everyone else will do. It was always run by the female elders or the matriarchs of the towns and villages. And also, if a male chief was sort of misbehaving or had become corrupt, it was the duty of the matriarchs to remove him from power. So there was this beautiful built-in balance. So it doesn't look like patriarchy just with women in charge. It's a very different, whole different structure. And I find that really fascinating because it's not saying that men shouldn't have any power. It's just simply saying there needs to be a balance of power. And it's more democratic, actually. It's like I don't even know if democracy is possible without at least 50% women in charge or some counterbalancing force like that. That's primarily female. I don't think we've even had democracy in the U.S. because we've never had that. We've never had any female counterbalancing force to all the males that have run the show for so long. And even there's an interesting story about when some of the first explorers that are coming from Europe into this part of the world, and they were encountering these tribes, and they were trying to go through negotiation and trades and bartering. And the First Nations people that they encountered were saying, well, where are your women? Like, we don't make any decisions without our women. We don't trust anyone who wouldn't have their counsel with them, their female counsel. So even then, it just shows the huge difference in the paradigm of leadership. It's like the European paradigm was, we don't need women to, at least officially out in front, we don't need women's input. We're going to make the decision unanimously without them. And they'll just have to deal with the consequences. Whereas, a lot of the First Nations people were like, well, we don't trust just that one directional way of influence or making decisions. We have to have the whole spectrum.
Yeah, I have a theory on how things might go. I'll have to share at the end of the podcast for the future democratic society where it's going. But for now, in terms of your research, you said before the podcast about things that some of the women had to give up. And what were those kinds of things that they had to give up in this kind of society?
Yeah, there's a trade-off, right? And it's very interesting because you don't have, like in matriarchal cultures, pretty much as far as I can tell from research so far, you don't have the notion of housewives or a woman who stays home and doesn't earn money. That doesn't exist in a matriarchy, which some women might not like, some women would love, I don't know, but what that means is every woman is working her ass off. Like, she's working really hard. And in one of the most well-known, well-documented matriarchies that's around today, it's a group of people called the Musuo, and they live in the highlands on the Tibetan-Chinese border. And they've been there for thousands and thousands of years. And it's about 50,000 people that still continue this tradition. So the women live all together with the matriarch. The families are all structured around the matriarchs, and there's no such thing as sort of monogamous marriage. I mean, they have what's called walking marriage, where once a girl comes of age, she gets her own bedroom inside of this large house, and then she can start having lovers, and she can choose to be with anyone. And for as long as she wants. If they have a child, then the child is raised in her mother's home. And the father can come visit, but they never end up living together. He lives with his mother's clan, she lives with her mother's clan, and her brothers help raise her children. So the father of her children is also helping his sisters raise their children. And this is common across many matriarchal or matrilineal cultures. All over the world, this was done. It was even in ancient Kush, the Upper Nile region, which is now Ethiopia, parts of Sudan. it was the same. Even queens at that time ruled with their brothers. They had like a consort king. So it wasn't like the king is the ruler and then the queen just happens to be there because she married the king. It was actually the queen ruled the civilization, and the king was there to help her, raise children. But it wasn't. It just was a different balance of power, different emphasis. Like who was the kind of locus of the power? It was these regent queens. But the same thing is like this matrilineal focus means the women bear all the responsibilities as well. So they may have more power, but of course with great power comes responsibility. So they do all the hard work, labor, they do all the, they take care of all the finances, they're responsible for building the houses, keeping them maintained. They do all the child care, raising the children. And the men, and speaking of the Musuo tribe in China, the men may go out and do trade and different activities, but they're overall pretty passive, and they're more like housewives. They're pretty feminized in a way, if you want to use that term. It's, what we would consider more feminine is they're a little more passive and just not, even some of the younger generation of the Musuo, like the girls that were interviewed in a documentary I watched, they were like, yeah, we don't really find the men that attractive here. We want to move to the mainland China and marry a Han, and I want to be a housewife. And it's just like totally, they're drawn to like what they don't have. It's so interesting. That's an example of the trade-off. Is like, well, you want to have more power, great. That means you got to have more responsibility. You got to take more responsibility, and you can't have it both ways. You can't be a housewife and then, also be a matriarch.
Yeah, it's understandable. How do you see this linking back to the modern day conversation that's so prevalent in our culture at the moment, the gap between the sexes and the misunderstandings and the sexual abuse and the Me Too campaigns?
Yeah.
This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online.
Well, what's interesting is on the positive side of many matriarchies or matrilineal cultures is that there's very little to no sexual abuse. There's very little to no rape. There's much less violence overall and almost no war. So that is really a great, benefit of a more matriarchal culture. It's sexuality overall seems much more encouraged, much more supported. Children are taught to love their body and to explore their sexuality and to take lovers and, to just enjoy themselves. And I'm speaking generally because that's drawn from many, many, many examples from all over the world. That seems to be a theme that's emerging.
So it's the theme as well as the matriarchal side of things. It's kind of what I believe in as well. If we had a much more healthier relationship with our sexuality, whether it's patriarchal, matriarchal, whatever you want to label it, we would have less violence, less wars, less abuse.
Yeah.
That's
totally.
my theory, and your research goes along with that, and your kind of own belief system. You believe the same?
Totally. I mean, and you can see it in the animal world also. I mean, with like the bonobos, the primates that we're most closely related to as human mammals. They're amazing in the way they navigate conflict. They're not even all that sexual. Like most people who know about bonobos, the common misconception is they're just constantly having sex all day, but actually what they're constantly doing all day is touching each other. They're really sensual, and they're grooming each other, and they're making these sounds, and they're constantly helping each other, what I would say, regulate their fight or flight response to de-escalate violence and aggression. And then there is, of course, like, they're way more sexually active than almost any other primate on the planet. And they have no, very little violence. So,
So sexuality and sensuality.
yeah, it's not like they're just going around fucking all day. I mean, they're really super sensual animals. Like, they're constantly touching each other and grooming and cuddling. And there was an interesting scenario. I don't know if it was a bonobo or there might have been chimps, where like two male chimps were getting all heated up and about to like fight, and they were getting really aggressive. So basically, she went to one of the male chimps and started grooming him and soothing him, and then she went over to the other chimp and started grooming him and soothing him with sounds, and she got them closer and closer together and started grooming both of them at the same time, and then they kind of all made friends, and the fight was completely de-escalated, dissolved. So to me, it's just a perfect example of what's possible through the power of touch and sensuality. And it, like, on a primal level, if we can retrain and resensitize our bodies as humans to be receptive to pleasure as opposed to always guarding against pain. And like, we're such a punishment focused society. I mean, many societies are like shame and punishment oriented to modulate behavior. Instead, if we modulated our behavior through pleasure and nourishment, nurturance, like, it would be a totally different way to guide people and into their creativity and expression and more fulfillment. And I'm not saying that's the only way, but I think it is missing from society. It's a lot of there's a lot of repression around the body and sensuality.
What one element to all of that is time, because bonobos have a lot of time on their hands. They haven't got Facebook, Twitter, jobs, washing up to do, and all these things. But my point for that is to say maybe we should actually be more lazy and slow down and not have such a masculine competitive environment of business where we're having so much time spent on I wouldn't say meaningless, but tasks that can exhaust us, keep us focused on other things other than our body and our pleasure. Whereas if we did have a kind of a world where we did have more time on our hands, perhaps that world is coming with the advent of robots and AI. Yeah. Maybe in 10, 15, 20 years time, we'll have this conversation. We'll be saying, well, we've got a lot of time on our hands now. Maybe we can learn from the bonobos. So I think one element of that is time, and allowing ourselves the time to be more sensual with each other and less busy, and less like working our asses off. And yeah, the focus then might be on those things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's about balance. These impulses toward nurturance and sensuality, bonding, connection, communication, harmony, and then the other aspects of like drivenness and purpose and creation and building and structure and directedness. I mean, they're both parts of our soul. We all have elements of these, these aspects, which you could call yin and yang or feminine, masculine, but really they're just human qualities inside of us. So I think the last number of millennia, a few thousand years now in the West in particular, but all over the world, actually, there's been this transfer of power away from matriarchy to patriarchy. But overall, it's a very small, short period of time. Like the modern patriarchy, as I call it, is a very will be very short-lived if you look at the totality of human history. And I do believe it's been much, much, much longer that humans lived in a more matriarchal or egalitarian way, and that was just kind of the standard. And it wasn't even, to call it matriarchal and say it's all about female, the matrilineal focus may not even be accurate. It might just be like, well, this is a more balanced way to do things. It's just more harmonious. But what's interesting to me is to find, okay, well, why did this transfer of power happen? Why was there a backlash from men, in all these different parts of the world against the goddess-based religions, against matriarchal way of doing things? And to be honest, the more I look into it and dig around, the more it seems like there was actually a period of extreme corruption where, these matriarchies became corrupt, and these oracles and even the priestess class became very corrupt. And men were really being abused, in fact. That's something that no one talks about. And in ancient Anatolia, for example, which is now southern Turkey, there was a goddess-based religion, a civilization there, based on the myth of Cybele and Atis, her son. And in order for men to have any political power in that civilization, they had to become a priest. And in order to become a priest, they had to literally have their genitals cut off. Wow. They had to cut off their genitals. They had to become eunuchs. They had to throw their genitals into a fire, through ritual reenactment of the central myth. Hundreds of thousands, if not thousands of men went through this ritual, and many of them died. They bled to death or died of infection. And those that survived, they had to basically become women. They grew their hair long, they grew their nails out, they wore long robes that the priestesses wore. And this was going on for generations. So you can only imagine the kind of resentment that would build up over time toward a society that would require that of the men. And that the temple really was the center of the civilization. It was where everything got decided and done, and that's where you had power. Or you were just left out. So literally men were being emasculated, and, it was just a real out of balance picture. So it makes total sense in light of that. There would be this backlash. There would be this cry from the male psyche, like, I'm done with the Supreme Mother. I'm tired of the goddess. I'm ready for a deity in my image. I'm ready for the supreme male deity, for the Divine Father, and to change the whole way things were being done, and have a top down, and have all these things that emerged from the Mesopotamian region in response to the corrupted goddess religion. So that's from reading of Dunn, and it seems like the more I dig around, the more that's verified.
Well, we're certainly not in the Divine Father stage at the moment. We're in the corrupted father, abusive father.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's time to crack out of that shell. And how do we do it is the next question. For me, it's about stepping up and realizing that the gender isn't really the thing here. It's the stepping up into the higher aspects, and like you say, the Divine Mother, Divine Father aspects of ourselves, which would include attributes and personality types like unconditional love and nurturing love on the feminine side, and then the integrity on the masculine side, rather than the kind of behaviors that are prevalent in today's society, which is blaming, shaming, victimization, controlling, domination, where a lot of teachers, and myself included, we would say are these the more unconscious aspects, the less divine aspects, rather than having the separation of the sexes and the genders. We have a more self-aware ness of the masculine and feminine within us, and the more divine aspects within us, because it has to change within us before it changes on the outside. Do you see something similar as maybe a solution to the problems we face at the moment?
Well, it's tricky. I guess, when we get into the terms, it's hard because there's so many associations with masculine, feminine, male, female, and there's so much baggage that comes with it. So even in speaking about gender, it gets very messy, gender roles and all of that. But if there is, if we had just a deep reverence and we had a way of honoring all these attributes that are so positive in both women and men, that along the whole spectrum, I think it would be very different. I just all the way from the primal qualities, I think having a reverence for even our own ability to channel aggression in a positive way, for example, is important. If we didn't have any aggression, we would starve to death. The fact that we're predators on this planet is not going to change anytime soon, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. I wrote this little piece about predators and the difference between a predator and a perpetrator. Because what we're fighting now is this perpetrator archetype, like all this with the Me Too campaign and all this anger about sexual abuse. It's about trying to get rid of the perpetrator, right, and take them out of our society. But that's embedded in all of us to some extent. It's there. It's not saying that we all act on it, but it's part of being here on this planet. Is sometimes we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes we're going to do things that are in violation of someone else's integrity or in our own. And if we guide the neutral aspect inside of the impulse to get our needs met, if we just had more training around how to direct it in a healthy way, it would be different. Instead of shaming the fact that we're here and we need to kill things in order to live, even plants, whatever you eat, you're taking some other life form in order to survive. That's just the way it is. And sort of in the sexual realm, and we all have a sexual drive. We all want to have our needs met. There's nothing wrong with that. It's again how we're directing it and how we've been trained to get our needs met, to go about getting our needs met. So it's very complicated. I don't think there's enough time to go into the nuances, but honoring the whole spectrum of what it means to be human, to me, is a good place to start, and as opposed to starting out shaming it. And then go into what is a healthy expression of even being a hunter, being a warrior, being a leader? What are the healthy aspects? The healthy aspect to me is you're a provider. The shadow aspect is perpetrator. The healthy aspect is you're providing for the whole tribe. You're providing for the needs of others. The perpetrator is just there to take from everyone else, and winner takes all. But the provider is there for the whole, and that to me is the direction we can move in. Whether you're a man or a woman, is move in the direction of being a provider with your innate drive, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah. Should we sum up with maybe a future vision of society in 20, 30 years of what you and I would,
sure.
what it might look like? Well, I've been studying AI and blockchain technology and all these different things. Within 10, 15 years, I think we're going to struggle to go back to sort of the matriarchal or even patriarchal societies of old, because there's so many people on the planet, and there's so much technology is going to change in us. And I can kind of foresee that with the growing number of people like you and I, and all my podcast guests, all the people you have in your network, and the whole network that's spread across the world with sexuality education, we can get to a place where we do have a better relationship with sexuality and sensuality, because the education will be more prevalent out there. And that education may well come in various forms, but one of the forms may be through AI. If we can program the AI to teach us certain things from a younger age, it would certainly be easier to reach everyone more quickly. So we might start having a better education with sensuality and sexuality within 10, 20 years. Like everyone kind of understanding these things. Because me, it's just about education, really. And then we might be able to start forming a more balanced society. And perhaps with the advent of robots, as I mentioned earlier, we will have more time on our hands to explore these parts of ourselves more. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think it's going to take some time and patience and a lot of work from the people who are doing this kind of work in these realms with all the things we've been talking about. And there's sort of a lot of other things that need to happen on the planet anyway, but I think this is quite a core thing that needs to happen. So that's where I see it going, kind of AI programmed education alongside our own kind of one-on-one, person-to-person education that's happening out there already. Will help us kind of form a more balanced society. So
that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been looking at this trend. Tech is the fastest moving force on the planet today.
Yeah,
and the only other force moving globally as quickly and comprehensively is the rise of feminine. Is really let's say the rise of feminine consciousness, but also the emergence of women back onto the stage, onto the public stage. And I say that with confidence because I'm connected to these networks all over the world, and pretty much every country there's a movement of women saying it's time for us to enter public office and start new businesses and start NGOs and all over the world. So once that reaches a tipping point, there is a critical mass already building, and it's going to seem like overnight this big shift took place, but really it's been happening for a century or more. But I think it's very intriguing because the movement of AI and where tech is taking humanity. If those two forces merge and integrate, like you're explaining, I think that's the only hope for the future.
Well, there is a company out there at the moment called Singularity Net. They're doing a initial coin offering ICO on the Ethereum blockchain network, which enables people to invest in their AI, where it will be a voting system. Where with blockchain, the good thing about it, all the news at the moment is about Bitcoin, but that Bitcoin isn't really the main thing. There's so much other tech going on blockchains, and Singularity.net allow a voting system where the people who own some of the coins that they have will be able to vote on what gets programmed into the AI unlike Google and Amazon, who at the moment are just a centralized force of AI and they're creating their own thing, this will be kind of the people's AI.
Exactly, yeah.
So there is definitely these tech opportunities which will allow the decentralization of education and AI and these opportunities.
And governance and
governance.
money. And I think women are actually, you could say it's a more feminine approach or a matriarchal approach to governance anyway, because it's more inclusive. Another thing about matriarchal cultures is there's little to no poverty or homelessness. You don't see people out in the street in matriarchal societies. Everyone is taken care of. And it's distinct from a communist model too. It's its own thing, it's way before communism. So it's just it's a value system of like everyone, the mother takes care of everyone kind of thing. No one is left out. But I see already in Indonesia, parts of Malaysia, you can see, and all over Asia and even Africa, the blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies are really popular. Women are just buying it up. I mean, it's accessible and it makes sense. And you don't have to go through the bureaucracy or the hierarchy to access it. So I totally agree. I think once women really kind of pick up on that, and not to the exclusion of men at all, but if those kind of polar opposite forces meet and merge and mix, I think we'll have it's like benevolent use of tech.
Yeah, the blockchain will allow a voting system as well, where what I may perhaps see is that there'll probably be I don't know how long it'll take, there may be an AI-based governance for perhaps each country, where everything can be tracked, so you can vote. Everyone can vote on the blockchain, and it's tracked, and you don't need to go to a polling booth. So we can vote on particular wars or not, or particular legislation going to office, rather than 50 or 100 or how many people they have in office voting on legislation. Like the whole country votes on it instantly.
That'd be amazing.
Like within a day, that can be done.
Incredible.
And can't be hacked. So, and that might be linked to an AI, which will perhaps ask us the right questions. So we kind of start building a utopian society from that. There's a lot of possibilities coming. It's just not as there's a guy I follow called Peter Diamandis who's really speaks.
Oh, I know Peter. Yeah.
Yeah, he speaks mostly about the exponential forces, and we're reaching that tipping point, as you mentioned with the feminine thing. There's a tipping point coming with the technologies at the moment, with the ones we've talked about, to transport, to ecological, to environmental. So there's a lot of opportunity coming in this 10, 20 years. It's going to be interesting to have this type of conversation of where we're at in 5-10 years time.
Yeah,
for sure,
definitely.
And it's certainly helpful to have these conversations just to know what has happened before and open our awareness to what is possible when we have this balance between the sexuality, sensuality, and knowing what is possible between the sexes, to have this peaceful, loving society with no war, no homelessness, when everything is more
and
balanced.
a lot more sex and a lot better sex.
We didn't even talk about that. So.
I mean, that's also a hallmark of matriarchal cultures. Is like there's a lot more freedom. There's a lot more, it's accepted. There isn't this like strict grid style morality around sexuality, and people seem a lot happier in that sense.
I guess that men should be open to that. I just can't imagine they could see, for example, I'm British, and the British Prime Minister Theresa May sort of advocating that kind of lifestyle. I can't see it.
Just like, and
if you were president of the world or whatever, I'm sure it would happen, but not so much. So.
Well, she's still kind of a patriarchal female.
Yeah,
there's a lot of like patriarchal women around, and they with those values, and it's not all. I forced myself the other day to write a list of 7 things that I like about patriarchy, just as a fun exercise.
Did you get 7?
I think I got 5 or 6, and and I realized it's really hard to know what's actually patriarchy and what is just corrupted human nature. Like what's corrupt society. What's a result of corrupt? Because the same thing could be said for matriarchy. It's like, well, if you look at corrupted versions of any system, you're going to make it wrong, but it's just human, it's whatever it is, human nature or instinct. Things get out of balance. They have to be course corrected, and so no one is immune to that corrupting influence. That's why we all need each other.
That's where I don't think.
I hope is like, yeah.
That's why I don't think labels and we have to be very careful with language, because immediately someone says patriarchy or even or feminism or whatever it is, you're immediately in separation mode, and once you get defensive, and it's very hard to come to a peaceful solution when the language is that way. When we can be more aware of what is happening without those language labeling happening all the time, then there's a much more opportunity for a better future, I think. So yeah, anything else you'd like to finally add?
One final thought is any period of history you look at it, you're going to see that when there was a big change that happened, it was in reaction to the previous cycle that came before it. So sometimes it's extreme, sometimes it's less extreme, but something to bear in mind is going to having the pendulum swing all the way to the opposite side is not going to be healthy either. And when, the rhetoric gets too toxic around demonizing all men, for example, I don't think that's useful at all. And it's not going to bring forth what we actually want as a society. Or I'm not speaking about you specifically. I just mean that in media, you can find a lot of negative rhetoric around just demonizing men. And I find that to be extremely unhelpful. So to be aware of we all are subject to certain corrupting forces. It's not to negate what's happened, and it's not to say we shouldn't hold accountable people who have abused their positions of power, but to look at the trade-off and to look at, like, can we move toward a balanced, integrated version of synergy? True balance leads to synergy. That's really what I want to see. Synergy between men and women and all people is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, same.
So, yeah.
Wow.
But thank you for having me on. This was lovely.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to have this synergy. We're working examples of it at the moment. I think we created synergy on this podcast, so it's been a pleasure to have you on as well. So thanks for taking your time.
Yeah. On to the next wonderful creation, right?
This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online.